Hey everybody, welcome to the Blendr Report, where news meets rational thinking. I'm your host, Jonathan Harvey. This is your co-host, Liam DeBoer. Liam, what's up, bro?
Not too much. Today we are going to be chatting about an intelligence report claiming that anti-government narratives could tear apart the fabric of society. A bad week for liberal economics with 3 spending scandals being illuminated. Milei, the new Argentinian president, chainsawing 70,000 state jobs. Trudeau pledging $8.4 million to study the link between climate change and the rise of authoritarianism. Liberals being forecasted to lose the 2025 federal election so badly that they may not even be official opposition. An alarming excess deaths rise in Australia, prompting Senate inquiry, as well as Canadian MPs voting to launch full probe into Chinese security breach at the Winnipeg Biolab. However, if before we get into things, you wouldn't mind giving us a kind review on Spotify or subscribing to our YouTube channel wherever you are watching, that would be greatly appreciated. All right, let's get started. So first off, we've got an intelligence report claiming that anti-government narratives could tear apart the fabric of society. A recently released intelligence report warns of the increasing normalization of threats against politicians driven by extremist narratives fueled by personal grievances, misinformation, and deliberate lies. The report identifies ideologically motivated violent extremism as the most likely threat to impact Canadian federal elections, highlighting a range of grievances and personalized narratives across the political spectrum. Grievances may stem from xenophobia, gender issues, or anti-government sentiment. So, why is it that the government spotlight of blame is placed on the reaction to their aggressive policies rather than the failures of them?
I think you have to try to understand who's funding these guys, right? So this said it was done by a group that were monitoring elections, right? So they were put together in 2019. So this group was put together. It's a combination of people from RCMP, some other government organizations, but they're employed by the Liberals. For better or worse, it just is what it is, right? So this group was put together in 2019 to monitor and watch elections. So here's what I've kind of identified. You were put in place in 2019. Well, you didn't do a very good job in 2021 when China interfered in our elections, or did you do exactly what you wanted to do? Did you want to help Trudeau win? In either case, those are the same people that made this report, so that invalidates the entire thing, obviously, right? So for me, look, you see this, and the first thing I think of is does this report actually reflect extremism? Or is it simply justified dissatisfaction with the Liberal Party being repackaged by a government agency to manipulate the narrative?
I think there is a genuine rise in, say, violent beliefs towards politicians and all of this kind of stuff as to whether how normalized it is, quote unquote, as they would say. That, I think, is brought into question. I don't think, you just walk down the street and say to, XYZ person you run across, I dislike this politician so much that I wanted to see them guillotined in the street or something. I don't think anybody would be like, that's normal behavior. There is definitely a rise, but I don't think it's normalized by any means. You can even just see that, people in social media comment sections and such are genuinely really pissed off at these people.
Right.
But how much of that too is just a expression, like how much of that is genuine to the point where they would actually ever act on it? That's where I think things get sketchy. Like it's like if somebody was to say, "Oh, I'm gonna kill that guy for what he did to me." It's like, do you take that threat of killing immediately seriously? I'd maybe wait until I see some plans in motion before I'm like, hey, that's a little bit extremist, whatever you're going for there.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple things here. First, I kind of say, like, let's denounce legitimate physical threats against political leaders. Now, to your point, I think it's interesting when you highlight, say, hey, there's a rise in this one thing, right? And it's sort of the Newton's third law of physics, right? What I think has happened here is you have to look at the correlation between the behavior of our government, the position they've put citizens in, and then the increase in rhetoric. And 100%. I think when you connect these two, you're like, oh, okay, like I see this is a cause and effect situation. But I think it really boils down to this one thing: is what's the level of action being taken? Now, look, I know that is a bit of a dicey thing to say, because all it takes is one lunatic to actually take action, and then people like you and I look like fucking idiots, right? But when you're saying stuff like this, at the end of the day, like, I feel like it's sensationalized. I think that it's rather hyperbolic, and I think that they're using it to maybe bolster their own base or maybe scare anybody away from having those thoughts or opinions or being upset with the government, because now you're being lumped in with this group of psychopath killers. You know what I mean?
100%. And there's no focus at all on things like the fact that our Prime Minister went on stage and asked whether we should tolerate the unvaccinated. They're mostly racist, misogynists,
homophobes, don't forget.
Homophobes, yes, all of this. And, for a leader of a country to say, should we tolerate these people? And then went on to illuminate that they're taking up space and stuff like this.
This was the cornerstone of his platform,
exactly. And this is also this is one extremely powerful individual talking about whether society should keep millions within their midst.
Yep.
That's much more dangerous than a couple upset lunatics on the internet.
Yeah, beacon on Twitter. 100%.
So, and then two, also sitting here saying these anti-government narratives could tear apart the fabric of society, when our government has been pushing narratives for the last decade or more about issues that end up doing exactly what they say they're worried about: tearing apart the fabric of society, turning white people against black people, straight people against gay people, against women against men, and all of this. It's undeniable at this point that the more widespread these narratives become, the more social unrest there is between identity groups.
For sure.
And so their narratives are tearing apart the fabric of society. So I think their pointing the finger is just baseless at that point, or doesn't mean much coming from them.
No, you know what? I totally agree with you. I think, you want to look at a couple of other things that they've done to tear apart the fabric of society. Let's talk about the pandemic. When they basically said, you need to rat on your neighbor if they have anybody over, including their own kids that maybe live in Toronto when your parents live in Aurelia. Like, get out of here, man. So the reason I have a problem with that, if you look at a nation and you boil it down, what gives it the strength? What is actually sewing the fabric of society together is the strength of neighborhoods. It's literally that tight. That's what matters. It's neighborhood to neighborhood. It's like watching your own, then watching your neighbor. You know what I mean? That's kind of how that works. They tore that apart. And they incentivized and rewarded people for ratting on their neighbors. And it was like the most direct way to tear apart the fabric of a neighborhood that I've ever seen come from a government in my entire life. So for me, that was totally wild. Another thing that I would point out, and it may be a little touchy for some, but mass immigration. When you push no sort of assimilation, and I don't mean that in an effect. I don't mean that in an aggressive way. I just mean if you go to the United States, you're an American. You're an American Italian. You're not Italian that lives in America. If you come to Canada, you are where you're from first, and then you're in Canada. That's how it works here. That's just an easy way to sort of designate it. But the thing is, we don't really have much of our own culture anymore. And then when you're pulling people into this country, rather, over 1 million a year right now, we just crossed 41 million. We took 9 months to go from 40 million people in Canada to 41 million. That is wild. We are on a wild trajectory right now. So when you take those things and put them together, go, our culture is already weak. We don't push any sort of assimilation or culture on new people that are coming in. In fact, what we say is have your own culture, and sorry we offended you. That's kind of how we take it. And then we pull more and more millions of people in every year. What do they think is going to happen to the fabric of society, right? Because people say diversity is our strength, but actually what makes a group strong is finding commonality.
100%. And this goes to that idea where I think you can definitely have a multi-ethnic state. You can have people from all over the world living under one quote unquote roof,
for sure,
under one national identity. But what you can't have, and this is the lie that we were sold by our Western governments, is multiculturalism. You cannot have a bunch of people operating in a similar group with different values and different goals.
Exactly.
If a group is going to be cohesive, it needs a common uniting narrative.
Yep.
And that is your culture per se. And so, I think we were definitely sold a lie on that front. And then there is something to be said about mass distrust in institutions can definitely cause societal upheaval. But the thing is that those institutions aren't just deserving of respect and bowing to their authority simply because they exist, much like they are trying to convince us right now. It's like, well, we have these democratic institutions, so you have to respect them, and questioning them is dangerous. And then it's like, no. It's up to you to live up to the responsibility of these democratic institutions. Like, it's like if you're in a relationship with somebody and consistently they go around behind your back cheating on you or something, and then they blame you for the fact that there is growing distrust in the relationship, and that's tearing apart the fabric of the relationship. It's like, no. It's your actions. It's your not caring for this relationship, which is leading to my distrust. So, yes, there is a problem with losing faith in institutions. Social institutions are important, but when they get corrupted and they ended up turning against their citizens, pretty much is what we're seeing now.
Yeah.
They're operating for their own sake, not for the people that they claim to be representing.
100%. I think at the end of the day, the onus is on them to maintain our trust. That's how it's got to, and you do that through action. You do that objectively through how you operate. And the thing is, the only reason people don't want to inherently distrust their government. I would like to feel safe. I would like to live in a society where everything was moving smoothly, that we weren't suffering economically, that we had a reasonable number of homes given, the supply and demand needs. But these are all problems we have because of them. This is not because I want to be upset. It's because they are making such a mess of this country. I have no other choice but to push back. And just one thing I'll finish off, just this part is, I don't mean to over-contextualize, but, you made a good point about multiculturalism. My point previously had nothing to do with diversity. I don't care where you're from. I'm happy with everybody and anybody. That's got nothing to do with it. But like you said, it is about kind of finding that commonality that gives a country strength. And when you move people in at this pace and you don't push people towards any sort of commonality, you create a disaster. That was my point.
Let's move on here to a story that is most likely just going to cause more distrust in the government. So we've got 3 spending scandals coming to light.
Oy.
I think we'll take them one by one. These, this isn't just spending that happened last week alone, but they are issues that have been illuminated just within the last week. So first off, we've got Ottawa spending $42 million on a gun buyback that still doesn't exist. So they spent all this money on a confiscation program that has not yet been implemented and not having bought back a single gun. The estimated cost of the entire program is projected to be around $2 billion, significantly higher than previous estimates. So this is a massive issue when you consider that this policy in the first place, this massive gun confiscation idea it wasn't politically popular in the first place, and now you've also got them wasting money at a unpopular policy.
Yeah, so first things first, fuck these people, keep your guns. Just flat out. Just don't give them up. No matter how much money they want to give you, don't do it. It's going to cost you more in the long run. Second of all, look, you see programs like this and they're just full of corruption. And this is such an obvious, like $42 million. How could you possibly spend that much money on a program that has literally done nothing if corruption is not the number one expense? I'd be wide open to hearing them out here, but there's going to be zero. No one's going to have a good answer. $42 million. That is such a, they throw around these numbers like it doesn't matter. Oh, just $42 million. Are you kidding? The average person, like, what is their worth? You consider that how much money people contribute to the government, and they just throw this money around like it doesn't matter. It is so discouraging to watch this. And it just continues to happen. One thing after another. They just continue to do stuff like this. In a program like this, look, like to my original point, this is just going to give them more power in the long run. There's nothing good about this policy, and they're running the whole thing so poorly that hopefully it blows up in their face.
He implements these policies saying they're going to clamp down on crime. Meanwhile, crime continues to skyrocket under everything he's doing, and he makes it easier for criminals to get out on bail and not face harsh sentencing. So he's saying that, we're going to stop crime by taking away law-abiding citizens' rights to firearms, and meanwhile taking it easier on criminals. These two things do not line up.
They do. Here's why. The more crime you have, the easier it is to convince regular citizens to give up their guns.
True, but that isn't going to solve the cause of crime. And that's what I'm saying.
Their intention's not to solve the cause of crime.
Yeah.
Their intention is to take your weapons away from you.
For sure, because, you and I point to the fact that we are slipping into this very totalitarian style mindset and entering a physical world that is slowly starting to resemble it. And it's really important to point out the fact that, like, I don't think a lot of people realize that the leading cause of death in the 20th century was innocent civilians being killed by their governments, whether that be for political reasons.
Wow.
250 million is the estimate.
That is wild.
250 million. So that's when you consider account all of the totalitarian regimes of, like, that takes into consideration the fascists, the Nazis, the Soviet Union, China and Mao, North Korea, Cambodia,
Sure.
all of these regimes. But one of the things that all of those regimes did in the lead up to their rule was mass disarmament of their citizens.
Of course.
And so this outsourcing of safety to the government is the number one quickest route to an unsafe society.
Well, I mean, you're seeing it in the States too. Like, not for nothing, in 1776, when they created the Declaration of Independence, they had some pretty good ideas. Back then, they understood the rise and fall of governments. They understood why these things happen. And to this date, 250 years later, we're still fighting to maintain that right, or they are still fighting to maintain that right, because they still understand the importance of it. And every time they get taken away, like you said, just look at history. And that's just the last 100 years you're talking about, right? So look, at the end of the day, the program's flawed. And man, I just don't know what happens to us if we do give all of these up. People think it's conspiracy theory to think that way. But like you said, just look at history.
And it's not even like there's one example in history that you can point to and then people will be like, well, that's an isolated case. You're like, no, this is something that has been reoccurring all throughout human history. So a disarmed population is definitely not a safe one. And to your point about, say, mass shootings and stuff down in the States, it's like, that is a real and legitimate problem. If you also look at gun violence and gun deaths, it often correlates to the places with the strictest gun policies.
Yes.
And then, but also, my point isn't that isn't a problem. It's that the alternative of an unarmed citizenry is a bigger problem than the mass shootings, because wait until you see the size that mass shootings can reach when you've got
a disarmed society and a tyrannical government. That's a really good way of looking at it. Yeah. I agree.
Okay, and then the other spending scandal from the week, we've got two more coming up here, but the next is the proposed changes to the Federal Elections Act will allow 80 federal politicians to qualify for a House of Commons pension without needing to win another election. This move, criticized by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, may cost taxpayers up to $120 million if all 80 MPs lose their seats. So, a seemingly money grab here for work that isn't well done. I don't think Canadian taxpayers should have to pay the pensions of people that have made their living conditions extremely worse. But to your point again earlier about just money like that they think is nothing, $120 million, it just ends up, it's just
pocket change. They don't care.
Adding up to the point where, Canadians are just getting robbed blind here.
You know what's interesting about this one? They're actually 32 of the 80 MPs are conservatives. It's actually more conservatives than any other group. It's conservatives, liberals than NDP. So you're not going to see a lot of pushback from anybody. But what's interesting about saying that is it's also very likely that all 32 or the large majority of those conservative MPs will get reelected, so that it would actually be inconsequential. But because they're the leading group there, I don't see anybody pushing back against this. And they also tied it to something. They also tied it to something like Diwali or something like that.
I saw that too. Some people were trying to pull it back, saying that there is a holiday for Southeast Asian religions like Buddhism and Hinduism and stuff like that. That there is a holiday falling on the proposed election date.
So because there's a cultural holiday, as Canadians don't have any of their own culture, we're going to just charge Canadians another $120 million because a holiday falls around the time you're supposed to have an election? Don't give me that shit. Okay, then bump it back a week.
Yeah. Bump it up.
Problem solved. No big deal.
Yeah.
What are we talking about here? Don't give me that bullshit.
Yeah,
Another
because
120 million.
realistically, you could do that without having to do any proposed changes to the bill, right? Because
No
it says
issue
that
whatsoever.
It says that election has to happen by
Before.
latest.
Exactly.
By
So
latest.
that's all this is.
So it
This
can
is just a maneuver. They're trying to cover it up, but it's just about padding their own pockets. It's so discouraging, man. You know what's funny? A part of me wants to get in there and try to fix these things, but I don't want to be a part of the government apparatus.
Yeah.
That's why it's like this weird. I'm kind of in this kind of gray area, or like in limbo on it, because I'm like, it needs to be fixed, but I don't want to get in the middle of it because I think it's so broken. I think it would stifle your ability to actually affect change.
I think as soon as you hop in, you actually render yourself more ineffective at creating change. I think you can do way more from the outside than you can from the in.
I think the big one is to, like, you know, I have ambitions to, you know, one day make $1 billion. I don't know if it's ever going to happen, but it's just, you know, one of those funny little North Star goals you have. But having that kind of money and not being politically affiliated is how you can make, I think, the most change.
For sure.
You know, but it's just, I don't know. How am I going to get there? Taking donations.
Yeah. Just start a gun buyback program. Yeah. You'll get lots of money.
I'll do it for $1 billion.
Yeah.
I'll let everybody keep their guns too.
Yeah.
It's perfect. It's so good.
And the last scandal that found its way into the light last week was taxpayers being billed $115 million for Niagara Falls refugee hotels. So Canadian taxpayers have spent over $100 million to house asylum seekers in Niagara Falls hotels from February 2023 to February 2024, accommodating nearly 5,000 individuals. Each claimant was provided housing for an average of 113 days, costing approximately $208 per day. These expenses covered meals, lodging, services, and security measures. The Immigration Department noted that the reported costs are conservative estimates due to incomplete monitoring in 2023 and pending invoices for expenses since January 1st, 2024. So this issue isn't that number that they're tossing out, $115 million, might be on the lower end.
It definitely is on the lower end.
Yeah.
So, you know what's interesting? Rather than sort of attack the ridiculous policy here and us losing all this money, I was in Niagara Falls a couple weeks ago, and I was someone else had paid for our accommodations. So, but there was 2 hotels by the same name. So I think it was Embassy Suites, and they gave us the address for one of these refugee hotels. Obviously, we were staying at the other one, but we went in there. What a weird situation. Like, everything was boxed off. All the restaurants were closed. Everybody's hanging out in the hallways. I walk in there and I'm right away, I'm like on defense, because it was a bunch of military age men from different parts of the world. I'm like, what the fuck's going on here? And Meg's like, there are bunk beds in the windows. And we go and talk to the lady at the front desk, and they're like, there's no way you're booked here. I'm like, the address. She's like, you're definitely booked at the other one. So we take off, but it was like, they had all the parking lots blocked off. Everything was like, it was almost like they had all been isolated into this, like into the, I don't know if it was what direction it was, but when you first pull into Niagara Falls, that whole like first section of hotels were all kind of boxed off, and they're all refugee hotels. It was such a weird experience. It was just like, oh, okay, this is really happening, and here it is. Now I'm seeing it live. You know what I mean? You read about these things, and a lot of times people think maybe it's hyperbolic or not really the way it's going. That's definitely what's happening. They'd taken over that entire hotel, and I mean, it was probably, you know, like, it was probably 25 stories, at least 20 rooms per floor. It was wild. Anyway, yeah, personal experience.
And you think what quicker way to turn Canadians against, say, other nationalities and immigrants and stuff than to push the pace of immigration at such a level that Canadians can't afford a home, and then you tax the fuck out of them in order to provide for these people who land here and can't provide for themselves.
Of course.
So you're now ruining my economic future and my chance at generating real wealth, because let's be honest, the way that most people end up having wealth that can sustain them over their life and then also hand down to the kids is through property acquisition.
100%.
So you're robbing my chances at that, but then you're also robbing me blind as I go to
bolster your own voters. That's what this is. That's all it is right now. And one of the things, actually, Meg made a really good point when I was there, my wife. She goes, what are these people doing all day? She's like, you wonder why there's violence and issues. She goes, these people don't have any purpose. They're cooped up in a hotel all day. That's why all the guys are on the main floor, in the hallway, in the parking lot, everywhere. And you're just like, there's 50, 60 dudes here with nothing to do all day, and you're giving them enough money to live. What do you think is going to happen? And I was just like, yeah, that's a really good point. Let's get in the car.
Yeah. This is something that I guess where I was trying to get to with the whole idea of how do you expect everyday Canadians not to project some of that anger and discontent towards these immigrants coming here. It's like, that's not what I'm not saying that that's valid or that's justified. At the end of the day, I am very cautious of making sure that just any frustration or anger for these situations that I have are directed to the people that are
implementing
the policy.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I don't blame these people for coming here, for wanting a better life, or for at least trying any of these. Like, at the end of the day, I kind of commend them. Like, yes, if you want a better life and you're willing to go to the other side of the world to try and chase it, like,
sure,
that's commendable. But like, man, these politicians who are just ruining the lives of these people, selling them false hope, and then also ruining the economic prospect for Canadians. It's such a shit show. And, that's the last little scandal that popped up over the last week. But to your point about where these things it's just leaking money left, right, and center. And this is actually, I'll maybe share some wisdom from my mom that she once told me, because I remember her sitting she was couponing in a grocery store, and I was like, come on, Mom.
My mom does
you're
say
couponing,
shit. Yeah,
you're saving.
She'll go to all the different stores in Aurelia. I'd be like, oh, this one's got this on sale. I'm like, Ma, I love you. Let's go.
And it's just handing out, a coupon. Freshco is selling this for 50 cents cheaper than you guys and having it. And I said to her, Mom, this is ridiculous. Like, why you're holding up the line here? I was embarrassed. And she just turned to me and just goes, Liam, I didn't get to the point about not worrying about pennies by not worrying about pennies. And I was like, damn,
good
that
point,
stuck
Mom.
with me. I don't even know if my mom if she would ever remember saying that to me, but that one line has stuck with me for my entire life,
tight.
pretty much. I've never employed it. I've been terrible with my pennies.
No, but sometimes it's good to have that. At least you know why you're not where you need to be, though. You're right. You're like, oh, okay. Well, whenever I'm ready to apply this mom policy, I know it'll work. Just kind of finish up that point, with the immigration stuff. The reality is, like, we lowered our threshold to enter the country. You no longer have to have a reasonable set of skills to contribute to society. And the other thing is, this whole like bringing people in for votes and taxing Canadians and selling these people on a false dream. Eventually, nobody wins. Eventually, this falls apart for everybody and everyone's unhappy. So there's only one place this ends, and it's in complete disaster. It's just a matter of how long it takes to get there.
Well, moving on to the polar opposite of our government. Javier Milei, the new president of Argentina, is going to quote-unquote chainsaw 70,000 state jobs. So beyond the job cuts, Milei boasted Tuesday at an event that he's frozen public works, cut off some funding to provincial governments, and terminated more than 200,000 social welfare plans, which he labeled as corrupt. It's all part of his strategy to reach a fiscal balance at any cost this year. There's a lot of Blendr, Milei said in a hour-long speech at the IEFA Latam Forum in Buenos Aires, referring to the erosion of wages and pensions by 276% annual inflation, and went on to say there's a lot more chainsaw. So is Milei being too aggressive, or is this something other countries should seek to emulate?
So I think he's doing what he needs to do given the environment he's in, right? He's sort of radically reforming a country that needed radical reform. But I think you just have to kind of know your audience. It's kind of like technological adoption, right? If you change something too much for what society expects, they won't adopt it, right? But down there, because things are so volatile, this type of behavior is kind of like, well, it's this way or the other way. You're going to be either this aggressive in fixing the problem or that aggressive in being corrupt and making it worse, which is obviously why this guy stepped in. So all the credit to him. I'm a big fan of this guy. Love it. I think it's so funny. I think, though, if you took the same approach in America or Canada, you wouldn't make it very far for a couple of reasons. One, the political system is very guarded, so you can't get in with that kind of behavior. You sort of have to penetrate it in a way where you kind of play their game, and then you get into a position, then you can make changes, right? Which is obviously not what he did. He won on radical reform. The other big thing, too, is that these types of policies, they affect so many people, negatively, which is what needs to happen down there. But here, unfortunately, in Canada and America, you need a little more nuance. So, would I like to see something that happen? Yes, I would. I would like to see the equivalent of a Javier Milei in our climate. It's just that person would be a little more subdued so they could actually positively affect change.
For sure. Newton's third law of physics.
Yeah.
Our pushback doesn't require as heavy of a hand, right?
That's right.
But, it is notable to say that he, within a couple months of being put into office, he was just elected in November. He got the government boasted the first surplus in over 12 years.
Yep.
Then also monthly inflation in December was roughly around 26%. Then January was 20%. And then February was around 13%. So there does seem to be some positive movement on that front. That being said, there is also, I think, a lot of, say, the libertarian-minded people would be very hyper-focused on, say, those statistics, but then blow by certain others, like the fact that, and again, he devalued the currency on purpose because he wants to allow other currencies into their economy, like even the US dollar.
Yeah.
But so it was expected that their currency would devalue, but after doing that, paychecks went down 11%. So like there is definitely still, it's not like it's just a clear, all of a sudden all the poverty is being erased in Argentina. It's like, it's one of those things where I think that if you were to look at Argentina like a tanker ship, it's still headed towards a iceberg, but at least now it looks like they're starting to turn the wheel and trying to at least get away from it.
That's a good analogy. I like that. I mean, I think when you look at them almost hitting 300% annual inflation, you need to do something radical to correct course, like you said. Like otherwise you hit that thing head on and you're done. You know what I mean? Well, I guess they punctured the side. That was actually a really bad move by the Titanic. If that movie was accurate in any way, shape, or form, if the Titanic had hit the iceberg head on, I know, but bear with me. If they had hit it head on, they would have ruptured a number of the front compartments, but if they wouldn't have been able to stay afloat because how the ship compartments worked, they would have been able to lock it off, and then the front end would have been damaged, but they could have stayed afloat till at least someone came by. But the thing is, they punctured all up the side of the boat, and then how the chambers worked in the bottom of the boat is it was all these separate walls, right, from the front to the back. So they knocked open too many of them, so they couldn't close it off. So if they had actually hit it head on, they would have had a better chance of survival. Anyway,
no, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, but anyway, yeah, a little off topic for sure. But well, yeah, like to my point, when your annual inflation is 300%. It's going to be a nasty process to correct course. No matter what you do, there is no magic wand to fix that. But, given the numbers, he's sort of what we're seeing from what he's done, he's moving in the right direction. It doesn't matter the pain. It's going to be pain to get to the solution, but he's getting there.
So yeah, keep a keen eye on there, as that is definitely the forefront of the experiment for the policies that I think you and I like to champion. Radical government shrinkage and public spending. So we'll see. It's interesting for me. I look at it very closely, knowing that it tests my biases, and I like to be able to put my own ideas into check by keeping an eye on that situation. But
I love that there's a world leader right now that's winning by using a chainsaw.
Yeah,
that's his game. Like, all right, let's go.
Yeah. So moving on here to Trudeau pledging $8.4 million to study the link between climate change and the rise of authoritarianism. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced a surprise $8.4 million research project at a South Korea summit to investigate the link between climate change and the rise of authoritarian regimes. Trudeau emphasized that this investment aims to comprehend how climate change impacts democratic erosion globally and protect the human rights of environmental defenders. So what are the odds that this report ends up finding there's a direct link between climate change obsessed politicians and authoritarian tendencies?
Oh my God. We were talking about wasting money earlier, right? What are we doing? So if you're going to study things, right, there's got to be some sort of benefit to studying them. Or it says here that they're going to comprehend how climate change impacts democratic erosion globally and protect the human rights of environmental defenders. There's another thing that the Prime Minister also did. He allocated another $4.6 million to the IDRC to create an equitable and inclusive digital space. So that's great. You look at the way he's spending money and you look at what you're supposed to accomplish with these things. Why do you need $4.6 million to create an inclusive digital space? I can do that for $50,000 and I'll pocket 90% of that money. What are you going to create? Like a chat room? What are we talking about here? Okay, great. So absolute waste of money. And then you do these things with these this investigation. You're going to do this research. I feel like every time they do these things, we should get to know why you're doing it. What outcome are you hoping to see? And how are you going to benefit from this new information? You know what I mean? And when they do things like this that are a little bit nebulous, you're kind of like, there's nothing objective even being done here. What is the benefit? What is the reason for taking $8.4 million from Canadians to study this in some other part of the world? Because the answer is zero. Our healthcare is a mess. Our education system is an absolute mess. We have a myriad of affordability issues. We have a housing crisis, and we're spending $8.4 million to try to understand how democracy is connected to climate change in other parts of the world. What the fuck?
And then you've got people like an NDP MP trying to throw forward bills about putting people in prison for promoting the use of fossil fuels. And then also you've got Trudeau.
I forgot about that.
And then you've got Trudeau throwing forward hate speech bills, trying to put legislation in place that people can be preemptively put in prison for hate speech that they might commit in the future. How is this not gaslighting? How is this not like, there is a massive rise in authoritarianism. I agree with him on that for sure.
Yeah.
Like you're not going to find any disagreement with me there, but then you steal our money to fund reports that are going to say for sure, there are these external reasons, these natural occurring reasons that people are becoming more and more authoritarian, or governments are becoming more authoritarian, and democratic ideals are waning. And therefore, we need to take authoritarian measures to get back our democratic ideals.
100%. Give us more control and we'll save democracy.
Exactly.
Okie doke.
You know that is exactly how that's going to end up happening. And then, to your point about where people, again, say these things, these ridiculous things like, oh, it's just a little bit of money. Like, yeah, sure. When you take into consideration the entirety of government spending, and then you say $8.4 million, if you put it next to what they spend even just hourly, it looks minuscule. But when you add up all of these things, like, they were saying how $333 million pledged to various Asian initiatives in another summit, or $44.8 million in climate aid announced during a Caribbean summit. And then, so they're just offshoring more and more of our taxes to fight climate change in other countries. And it's insane. So, again, you look at the fact that Canadians are responsible for roughly 1.4% of global emissions, and then it's like, okay, so we have to cut our economy to save the planet from our 1.4%. But then, seeing as we're also not going to be as economically prosperous in the face of that, despite that, we also need to fund everybody else's fight against climate change. Like, what the fuck?
None of it makes any sense. I like when you put it that way. You could sort of tie a few things in together and you look at it more holistically, and you look at how they've got one policy over here, then something over here that sort of contradicts it or is in the face of it, to just say, hey, Canadians, these people are 100% working against you from every different angle with multiple policies. So when you see one of these things, first of all, highlight it as nonsense when it's nonsense for sure, but then start looking at other things and how they all connect, and how, like you said, this thing is just basically one big gaslighting campaign. None of this makes any sense. I wish there was an answer. What they said is that, Trudeau seems to have a habit of doing these things. He does them just before he goes to these summits to sort of like, to what's the word? When you're just sort of, you're basically politically, not a gesture, but you're doing something over the top so that you look good politically. You know what I mean? He's politically posturing in some sense, just so he looks better to these places. He did it online to Twitter. He donated like $50 million to Trevor Noah's charity at an event he wasn't even invited to. He's like, yeah, bro, I'm going to donate the government's money. Here's $50 million on Twitter. Bro, get in line. What are you doing? And then one of the things they mentioned is that his priorities, like, so he often earmarks funds for specific causes aligned with his priorities, such as gender equality or environmental protection. So it's all just this kind of nonsense liberal ideology that he's trying to push all over the world. And I guess the strategy here is, if we fund these things in different parts, well, then they're going to adopt our policies, and then they're on board with us, and then we have more power as a group. You psychopaths.
Will Storr wrote a book about the status game, he called it, and it's about how humans seek out status in groups. So our primary drive is to, one, find a community that we can fit into, and then seek status within that community, essentially climb the social hierarchy within that group.
Nice.
So you take into consideration who is Trudeau's group. It's all of these virtue signaling elites on a global stage. So building on what you were saying there, his only goal from we know that this guy is just a crazy narcissist. And so he'll actually put forward these beliefs and these policies, spend our money just so that he can have more social clout within this group of essentially woke political leaders.
Yeah.
It's like if you look at it within this WEF forum, and this is something that I've even noticed within totalitarian regimes in societies in the past, reading them historically, is like when China was going through their communist revolution, there was policies being put forward by provincial leaders and stuff that they knew were going to be absolutely terrible, that wouldn't actually do well for the citizens, actually end up starving them in many cases. But nonetheless, they would implement them to be able to get more sway and more power within the party itself. So it actually had nothing to do with the practical means. The things that they were pushing had nothing to do with the practical means on the outcome on the ground, and had everything to do with their positioning within their social circle. And then this ties into a concept from Rob Henderson. He revitalized a concept called luxury beliefs. And these are beliefs that people with high status can uphold and promote throughout society at no cost to themselves, but a major cost on the people that they claim to care about on the more disaffected level. So a good example of this would be how you can see people in extremely well-off circles claiming that marriage is an outdated institution, right? At like high levels of Hollywood and stuff, you see promiscuity being promoted very much, and the idea that marriage is somehow oppressive. Well, that idea, that social standard now gets brought down the social ladder essentially, and then you have people in more poverty-stricken areas that are now starting to adopt this idea, this luxury belief, so to say, and it actually ends up working against them, because that's one of the number one causes for, say, poverty, or also even just problematic childhood stuff. I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but what I'm pointing at is extremely powerful people will put forward things that simply make them look good, even if it brings nothing but suffering to everyone around them.
Yeah, it's so basically Trudeau is using the power of the Canadian government and our taxpayer funds to bolster his own identity on the global stage for, I don't know, I guess his ego and for whatever he's doing next.
The good news is that despite all of this self-serving idea of putting forward policies that actually end up hurting us, Justin Trudeau's constituents, this leads us into our next story and a little bit of a silver lining, which is the Liberals are forecasted to lose the 2025 federal election so badly that they might not even be the official opposition. So according to recent polls, the Liberals are facing a significant setback in the upcoming federal election, with predictions indicating that they may not even secure enough seats to be the official opposition party, a position that could be instead claimed by the Bloc de Québécois. The Conservatives are anticipated to secure a dominant 207 seats, marking an increase of 88 from the previous election. And in contrast, the Liberals are expected to lose 101 seats, retaining only 59, while the Bloc de Québécois is set to rise from 32 to 41 seats, surpassing the NDP as Canada's third most popular party. So if Trudeau truly believed in his liberal policies and his progressive agenda, the one that we were saying is harming Canadians and the poor, why would he not step down to ensure somebody else can carry that torch forward? Or is this proof that it has nothing to do with the proposed changes themselves and rather just him getting credit for them and being in the spotlight?
This just proves he's a narcissist and an egomaniac. That's really what it comes down to, right? Like, look, he gets in whatever form of media he's using. He was on a podcast the other day saying it, or he says it on mainstream media. And what he says was, well, it's just people are being fed misinformation. They're being radicalized. There's just extremism. Now, I want to clarify something. when he says that, he makes it sound like we all have control over the media. We have control over 5 to 10%, a small sliver, and they're doing better and better at censoring that as well. So that just shows you the volume of growing discontent that we are able to surpass this man who controls 90% of the media outlets, essentially through policy or through ownership. And we're still able to surpass him because of how upset society is with what he and the NDP are doing. That's what this is. It's so clear. Like, it's not just the Liberals, it's also the NDP that's going to slide down to fourth, below the Bloc de Québécois, or however that works out. This is just a clear sign. Canadians have had enough. None of the rhetoric that guy spits out is no one's buying into it anymore. And it looks like, barring some really weird radical flip right now, we are going to see change in this country, and the Liberal Party is going to really struggle to hang on after this term.
Well, it's interesting too when you realize that this polling also found that 61% of Canadians perceived the Trudeau government to be prioritizing the wrong issues. So a sizable majority don't think he's prioritizing the right problems, but meanwhile, every time he gets in front of media or on a podcast or any of these kind of things, he all of a sudden makes the claim that, that Canadians care about climate change and this and that. And this has actually been a long-standing point of mine as well when it comes to the the climate front, is people will stop caring the minute that they struggle to put food on the table. Same thing with these social justice policies.
Oh, 100%.
They're all well and good when everybody's doing well and they feel like they aren't struggling. But as soon as they feel like they are personally struggling, all this care for things out of their immediate necessities they no longer matter to them. And I'm not even shitting on people for that. I'm shitting on the fact that he's standing there still saying that this is what people care about.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I always look at it with the gender thing. I think it's really simple. You want to tell me you're a boy or a girl, I have to identify you as whatever the hell you think you are today. Cool. Unless it's life or death. Yeah. You don't give a fuck what I call you if it's life or death. Just save my life. That's all that matters. I know that's a little extreme, but it's just a good way of looking at all these nonsense issues. Because when it boils down to survival or putting food on the table or safety, you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When you look at sort of the foundational level of those things, if you don't have those, none of the nonsense at the top matters. This is a symptom of us having no real problems to deal with. That's what happens. That's why, a lot of these gender issues and all of these other sort of social justice issues are boiling over right now, because these people don't have real problems and haven't faced real adversity. That's kind of the real problem. And I know that's a little off topic here. But, again, I think you see polls like this, and it really does point to how out of touch Trudeau is, because every time he's on these things, he denounces the polls. Well, the polls don't make any sense. I've won elections and, the poll said this or that or whatever. I'll tell you something. If Trudeau thought that he could win another minority government with the NDP and maintain this coalition today, he would call an election. But he's not going to, because he knows that he would lose in a landslide right now. So regardless of what he says, his actions actually speak louder than words, because we've seen him do this twice now, where he calls these elections, these interim elections. We saw what happened the last time in 2021. He thought he could win a majority. He got stuck with a minority. Nothing really changed. If he thought he had a chance to maintain power in any way, shape, or form, you could bet there would be an election in 6 weeks from today. But he doesn't, and he knows it. So regardless of the shit that is coming out of his mouth, he knows the truth. And the reality is, all of these polls are sort of speaking to the discontent of Canadians. And it's not just one. It's literally dozens of them. And they're coming out every week, and it just gets worse and worse for the guy.
100%. All right, moving on to something here on the other side of the pond. We have got alarming excess deaths in Australia prompting a Senate inquiry. So the Australia's Senate has finally approved an inquiry into the nation's concerning trend of excess deaths. These deaths began rising after the COVID-19 pandemic, but not all can be directly attributed to the virus itself. Excess deaths refer to a situation where the number of deaths in a particular region surpasses what would normally be expected based on historical patterns and population demographics. Data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics reveals that excess deaths began in 2021, peaked in 2022, and continued even in 2023, remaining 9.9% higher than expected levels. The report emphasizes that, quote, the much higher than it predicted number of deaths from heart disease has has kept it to the top cause of death. They further concluded that COVID-19 vaccination is quote-unquote highly unlikely to be a contributor to the excess deaths, citing the documented decrease in COVID-19 mortality associated with vaccination. So are you as sure as the report that there is no link between excess deaths and mass vaccination?
No, actually, I think it's preposterous that they would say that. I actually think it's alarming how the Australian government is already convinced that it's not mRNA vaccination when that's the only new thing that has actually been added to the equation. So riddle me that. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, look, historically, excess deaths at 10% are quite uncommon, especially in a developed nation with robust health infrastructure. However, obviously, there are exceptions where you're going to get something like this. Wars and conflicts. That makes sense. You know, natural disasters. The thing with natural disasters is they're usually localized, so they won't spike an entire country. Famines are another one where you can have these issues where you see these uncommon spikes, but again, not in developed nations with robust health infrastructures. Now you get into the pandemic issue. Now, these can have this effect. There was some information on the 1918 Spanish flu where they're saying there was significant excess mortality, potentially exceeding 10% in some regions. I don't know that COVID ever hit those figures, especially with such a large population globally in comparison to what we had in 1918. However, you get the main point here is that excess deaths of 10% are extremely uncommon in developed nations during normal times. While significant events such as pandemics or natural disasters can lead to these things, Australia's scenario with a persistent 9.9% excess death rate, even in 2023, highlights that this is a very unusual underlying cause beyond COVID-19. And I do find it, like I said, alarming that they're already well, it's definitely not the only new thing we added to the equation. Are you sure?
The COVID explanation doesn't line up because everything we know about the mutations that were happening with COVID as the pandemic went on was the virus essentially chose the route to mutate towards transmissibility than to deadliness, right? So it became less deadly as it went on. And to your point about the fact that this is the only new novel approach that happened, and also the spikes almost perfectly align with the rollout of these mass vaccinations. This would be at least the number one question to look at would be the vaccine. But I think another area of concern would be how the pandemic ended up, because of lockdowns and a hyper focus on one thing, ended up pushing back, say, cancer treatments, or also you could argue that other people weren't getting diagnosed in proper time to deal with health issues.
For sure.
So that could definitely be a thing. But no matter what is happening here, at the end of the day, you have to chalk it up to mismanagement. So to me, I have less of a horse in the race as to whether this is because of vaccinations or this is because of lockdowns or this is because of whatever. But at the end of the day, all of these things end up pointing towards you guys implemented policy that ended up doing the exact opposite of everything you claimed it was going to do, which was save lives.
Yeah, I agree with that. So one thing I would highlight, though, is they said the number one cause of death, which has surged, is heart disease.
Right.
Right. And if you look at, and this is not conspiracy, this is both Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca and J&J, they've all admitted that this creates... It causes heart problems. It just does, whether it's, a small issue or whether it's a heart attack, whatever it's going to be. And even in this report, they admitted that there was vaccine-related deaths. They even admitted that this has happened. Now, there was a report that came out the other day that was talking about the volume of heart scarring that has happened from people that have got vaccinations. These particular ones. Look, I'm not a doctor. I don't have this stuff all figured out, but we have the pharma companies who implemented these things way too fast by every measure. And we know that they say one of the side effects for sure are heart problems, right? And then we've got this excess mortality rate in Australia that's over 10% years after the pandemic. And it's heart-related problems. And that's the spike. That's the issue that we're having here. So, again, when you look at that information, and then the Australian government immediately goes, well, it can't be this one thing, it really makes it seem like it's that one thing. It does. And look, I don't know. But when you look at all the information here, they're saying it's very uncommon to have it at 10%. That's the issue. It's definitely heart problems. That's the issue. The vaccines definitely cause heart problems. Okay, well, I'm just looking at all the things together and again saying this one thing. The only new addition to the equation were the vaccines. Is it that for sure? Definitely not. Not for sure. But if I were a betting man and if I were being logical and I were putting this together, and I'm not making a big leap here, I would suggest it played a significant role.
If this was just excess deaths in Australia, it wouldn't seem to make all that much sense. But when you look around the globe at all of the most highly inoculated countries, this seems to be a trend. You know, we also saw that the Philippines a couple months ago said that they were going to launch an investigation into that. I'd be interested to see how that's coming along. Then you're also seeing in the UK, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20% in excess deaths, I believe. And then in Canada, it's around 10% too, right? I think. So you're seeing all of these rises, but then you go look at places like Africa, and they're not experiencing the same thing, and they had extremely low rates of inoculation. And then also when you factor in the response to the pandemic, they also had low rates of COVID mortality itself. So you're just like, what the hell is going on here? It's not making sense. And I'm of the mind where I don't have enough information to make a confident assessment. I have my ideas, and I think I'm probably right on line with you. I just like to not try to be super confident. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's like, what else could it be?
Well, you just bolstered the point there. When you're looking around the world, and this excess death number is still in double digits in a lot of developed nations where there was mass vaccination. So, okay, cool. You just added one more piece of information that just makes it seem more likely. You know, at the end of the day, look, we don't know, but I really find it alarming when they voted 31-30 to actually do this inquiry. They did not want to do this. It was 2 years of labor for this one guy to try to get them to finally do this report. And the first thing they say at the top of their lungs, it's not the only thing we added to the equation. Okay, guys, well, governments do what governments do. And you know what? They were all complicit in this, and I think they're doing the best they can to make sure this doesn't fall back on them in any way, shape, or form. When you look at all this information and you look at the same thing happening in all these countries, it just, like you said, it's anecdotal, but it seems obvious.
Last story of the day here, we've got Canadian MPs voting to launch a full probe into Chinese security breach at the Winnipeg Biolab. So Canada's House of Commons has voted to conduct a comprehensive investigation into the security breaches at the National Microbiology Laboratory in Winnipeg. This decision comes after a contentious battle between the opposition parties and the governing Liberals. Initially, the Liberals attempted to downplay the issue and limit the scope of the investigation. They argued for a less extensive probe with fewer witnesses and reduced urgency. However, opposition MPs, particularly the Conservatives and the NDP, pushed back on these attempts. Ultimately, the House of Commons voted to approve a full investigation with only minor amendments. This means a more in-depth examination of the documents and potentially broader witness testimony, including those reluctant to appear. This decision follows an earlier attempt by the Conservatives to launch a probe, which was blocked by the Liberals and the NDP. So, for anyone who hasn't been following this story, it was found that before the pandemic, in 2019, 2 scientists were fired for being found to collaborate with the People's Liberation Army in China and sending samples illegally back and forth between one another and sharing data and such, putting even just like viruses into test tubes, marking them kitchen utensils and sending them overseas. But so, you know, at first the Liberals were very skeptical and didn't want to push forward with this, claiming it was a non-issue, which was weird. The NDP was kind of backing them as was stated there. But what made the NDP switch their tune on this investigation from initially trying to shut it down to seemingly supporting the motion now?
Well, you know what? I have actually a kind of a darker thought on this than it being something positive, unfortunately. I don't believe the NDP would throw the Liberals under the bus at this point based on the power dynamic in the coalition. So I'm of the mind that they had enough time to do their own research here and be like, okay, have we covered up enough stuff? Have we removed enough things, redacted enough documents right now that we can let them go in there and do an inquiry and they won't find anything substantial? That's what I'm guessing, and that's why I'm guessing the NDP flipped. And it just seems like they're doing the right thing. You know, like what I remember writing was that we'll never get the full story, but it's good to see the majority of MPs use logic over partisanship. However, now that I've given it a little more thought, I do believe that we will find nothing here because they've had enough time to rummage around in there and cover up what they needed to. And you know what? That's a bit of a stretch. That's my own thought process. I have nothing to back into that. There's no proof. It's just the way I feel. Like, there's no way, in my opinion, the NDP, because they did their own investigation first, right? They looked into it to say, how much trouble are we actually going to get in here? And I think that they know that with 100% confidence that this is not going to be, the end of the road for Trudeau. So I'm of the mind that they've got this all figured out. They're doing it sort of in cahoots with the Liberals, and they're just standing up and pushing back and being like, see, we're being responsible MPs, and we're being a good party, and we're doing what's right for Canadians. And the reason I think this is because you and I talked about this before. If Canada was complicit in some way, so to give people a little more background, these viruses were actually sent to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, not just anywhere in China, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where this virus very likely came out of. We sent them they were sending actual viruses to that lab, and one of the two Chinese assets was working on gain-of-function research in that lab. That crossover gets pretty dark when you look at that. You're like, there's a lot of coincidences here. This looks pretty bad. And now they can't find these people. They're in China somewhere. They've gotten away with it. It's no issue whatsoever. And then you also look at how the United States was complicit in this by funding this research in China as well. And then when you kind of look at this mess and you go, okay, well, it looks like the virus was man-made. It was released out of China. Canada might have been complicit. The United States looked like they were, at least financially. This can't come out. This can't be a story that implicates these countries because you've got mass revolution. You have a real problem if this comes to light. So it's too significant an issue to actually come out with any real truth. Some of the mind, we're going to get the dog and pony show on this.
I don't even disagree with you all that much there because you can't even differentiate between the NDP and Liberals at this point. They are acting as one party, and they would share in the blame as one party for that as well, right? If it comes out that Trudeau and the Liberals were supporting this type of research and all this kind of stuff and did these crazy cover-ups, well, it's also the NDP is responsible for keeping them in power, so they share that blame as well, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah, I hope something comes of this, but or that there's at least justice. I think if you look at mass issues that have occurred throughout human history, there's almost nothing on this scale that can be said to be done from a global mismanagement level. There's certain things within, say certain regimes like in China or Soviet Union where their policies did lead to mass starvation and stuff. But on this, like, you shut down the world economy for illegal research that you guys were conducting. This is crazy.
This looks really bad on them. I agree. And it just can't come out. It's one of those things
people will jump out of their hotel balconies before this comes out.
100%. This is getting buried. One day it'll maybe come out. It'll be, the JFK files, of 2200 or something like that. I don't know. But it's just not going to, there's just no way we're going to get any real information here. And, one of the reasons I say that with confidence is look at the number of things there have been inquiries done on since Trudeau has been in power. The guy's still in power. What has ever come from any of these public inquiries? Anything? No, the answer is nothing. So, I imagine this is going to fall into the exact same category.
But the government of transparency and accountability.
Yeah, just take millions more of our taxpayer dollars to pay for this inquiry. That's going to accomplish nothing. God, this system's so corrupt.
Anything else you wanted to add for today?
No, sorry, leave everybody on a bad note again. I feel like we do this all the time. My bad.
Before we get out of here, don't forget to head over to our website to sign up for our newsletter, which goes out 6 days a week. That's blendrnews.com, BLENDR news.com, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye, everybody.